Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Heather Ruiz, Director of Marketing for Talking Parents, and on today's Co-Parenting and Coffee, we are joined by Dr. JoAnne Pedro-Carroll to talk about raising resilient kids through co-parenting. Dr. Carroll is a clinical psychologist, therapist, and an award-winning author of Putting Children First: Proven Parenting Strategies for Helping Children Thrive Through Divorce. Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Oh, thank you, Heather. I'm delighted to be here to focus on one of my favorite topics. That's resilience and how we as parents can build strong connections with children. And, I've learned so much from the children and parents I've worked with over the years through my clinical practice, research I did as a university professor, and a support group program that I developed for children. And I'm so delighted to be able to share. There's so much good news to share today. And through my work, I've often been inspired by the number of parents who come through, we all know, very tough times with family changes, but keep their children's needs a top priority and really help them develop with positive adjustment. So that's the good news I want to be sharing today. And I know that the people who have taken the time to be tuned in here today are motivated, that you want your children to thrive and do their best. So one of the things I've been so interested in my work is how is it that some families, after a period of adjustment, come through these, what are certainly stressful changes, but go on to really have healthy new beginnings and their children are doing quite well. And while others are on a different path and may have longer term problems. And it's such an important area of research because we want to know what are those protective factors that help children and families flourish, and what are the things that put children at risk. So, my focus today is to really unpack a lot of this, very valuable research information because we know the two most powerful predictors of how children do over time are the extent to which parents can contain their conflict, protect their children, keep them out of the middle, and the quality of parenting and family stability that children have over time. So there's a lot to say about that and how co parenting fits into all of that. So let's start with, and I just need to say we have a time limit today, and this volumes have been written about all of this. There are some handouts on your site there, and there's a lot more detail in my book, Putting Children First, that people can refer to. So let's get down to it. What exactly is cooperative co-parenting? It's that practice, as we all know, in which parents can openly communicate and collaborate about major decisions about their children. And the truth is, in every family, married, divorced, separated, whatever, uh, when there is that cooperative communication, it can be very helpful for children, as long as it's safe to do so, right? And I'll talk about that a little later. So I will also want to be clear: there's no one size fits all. Every family is different, but what we do know for sure is how important those two, containing conflict and quality parenting, are for children's adjustment. So let's start with managing conflict. And, I think about how conflict is inevitable in any relationship, right? It's
Absolutely.
how, it's how we manage it that makes all the difference. And I think it's especially true that it's a natural part of disengaging from an emotional relationship But, I think a lot about the power of the example when children can see parents managing their strong emotions and maybe even taking a break from a hot topic, heated discussion, and coming back to it later to focus on problem solving. That's a powerful, positive example for children. So
Absolutely.
when I work with parents, I often suggest that as they're renegotiating their relationship from former married partners, lovers, maybe even best friends, to think about their relationship now as co-parents to more like respected colleagues or business associates in the important business of raising children. And I, in many ways, think about it as, if you had a multi-million dollar business that you wanted to succeed, you would take a long-term perspective. You'd think about what are the goals of that business, and maybe one of your business partners does you feel like doesn't have your best interest at heart, or you don't get along with personally that well. But if you want that business to grow and thrive, you communicate respectfully. Certainly don't fire off an angry text or email at odd hours. uh, Stay away from blame and take a problem solving approach, right? So I think there are so many benefits for parents, and I hear this from them often, that being able to think about themselves as respected colleagues in the important business of raising their children really helps with that way of changing their relationship and having healthy boundaries with each other, right? Not getting into a lot of personal issues. And, another part of a foundation for effective co parenting is that long term perspective. If you want that business to thrive, you're thinking about how's it going to be 10 years down the road. Same with children and parenting. And it's tough. It's certainly in the early stages when the emotions are so high. But when parents can take that longer term perspective and think, how do I want my children to look back, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Will they be able to look back and say, yeah, my parents were apart, but they were there for me during all the major times in my life. I've heard some parents, sadly, adults that I've worked with who reflect back on their parents' divorce, who said, and this was particularly poignant to me, one man who had just won a major local election. He said, I can't invite my parents to be there because even though they divorced years ago, they still can't be in the same room together. So, the counterpart to that is the amazing success that can come from parents being able to manage and work with each other. So, what are some of the important skills and practices that contribute to children's resilience? Um, as I mentioned, we're going to get into all of this, including self care for parents, because none of this is easy. And parents' well being has a great impact on how children do. But let's start with some of those skills for co parenting that protect children from conflict. I think one of the first things that we know from emotional intelligence, from positive psychology, is managing strong emotions, right? How do we regulate? And this is tough when we've been hurt, when we're angry, when we're feeling enormous loss and maybe grieving. But being able to disengage emotionally from a former partner and be aware of situations that may trigger old hurts and anger, to be able to separate those feelings from your children's needs. And, I think this is interesting. Some parents I work with find it helpful uh, to have their child's picture pop up on their phone when they're getting a call from their former partner.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Isn't it? And, what we've talked about is how that helps to regulate their nervous system, helps to calm. Oh, there's my sweet baby. Oh, okay, it is a call from that other parent. But instead of anticipating and having that dread, um, just the image of a child and their smiling face can really help to regulate. And maybe you need to take some deep breaths before you take that call.
Well, and it kind of puts you in that mindset that this conversation needs to be focused on the child and not necessarily any conflict or past resentment or things along those lines as well.
Exactly, Heather. And
I love that.
yeah, where our attention goes, our energy flows.
Hmm.
So if our attention is on, there's my child, I'm going to put their needs right here in my heart, top priority, and assume that hopefully collegial or business like response to this call. And, of course, another important factor that goes into successful co parenting, and I think we all know this, that golden rule of never bad mouthing or denigrating the other parent. And I know that sounds so basic, but the number of times either children in the safety of the support groups that we offer um, have commented on how it feels like they integrate and interpret that negative message about the other parent as something negative about them. And they know they're part of each parent. So, there's a lot of wisdom that's come from children themselves. I've heard them say about, or they give advice to parents in a newsletter that we developed, and they say to their parents, please spare us the gory details. We don't want to hear about a parent's character flaws or something they've done that, or maybe even infidelity. I was working recently with a child who commented that, you know, her her parents thought she was asleep. And so often children are overhearing negative comments. And, I don't think most parents want their children to hear negative things about each other. But to be aware that sometimes, even if we think they're not hearing, they so often are. This child, who I'll call Shannon, was drawing a picture in one of our sessions, and she drew the feeling miserable with a trail of tears. And these are things often that children can't tell their parents. They feel it, but can seldom share. And when I asked her about miserable, she said, yeah, all the good stuff has gone away since my parents' divorce. The good stuff, I asked. She said, yeah, like how they used to snuggle me at night and read to me. But now I kind of have to put myself to bed, and I hear them on the phone at night talking about all the bad things that have happened in court that day. So for this child, the divorce wasn't the solution that her parents had intended to the end of conflict. But the fortunate part is, with Shannon's permission, when I met with her parents, they were very saddened, of course, and aware, and then were able to put their energy back on to Shannon and spending that quality time with her and having those positive bedtime routines. So important.
So, on that topic, so you describe quality parenting as a big part of children's resiliency and health healthy development. So, positive parenting. Tell me a little bit more about how that looks and some ways that we can give some ideas to our audience to help them kind of continue down that path so that they don't necessarily find themselves in a situation like Shannon's parents may have.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to talk about that in a lot of detail in a minute. I just wanted to add a couple more things about communication between co parents, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
All right. I often suggest to parents a weekly base touch to check in about their children. And again, it can be just a phone call like a business meeting, but with a very child focused agenda where you'd share updates of areas of concern for problem solving, as well as positive things about each child. And I think this is especially helpful now. This is September, back to school time, when there are so many important messages for school and schedules and activities. So many parents find it helpful to just have this in their calendar. Maybe it's a noontime based touch or a time that works for both of them. And timing is so important. It's so helpful to remember to not try and solve problems or communicate during what are known as HALT conditions. If you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, sick, or stressed, not a good time to try and communicate with your co-parent. And I think it's important to ask, is this a good time? Will this work for you? And another important part of communication is to express appreciation and positive reinforcement when things have gone well. And so often that gets overlooked, and sometimes um, some parents may even think that, well, why would I do that? We're not together anymore. But the truth is, everything we do in life that's important is about relationships and how important it is to express appreciation when things have gone well, and definitely emphasize the positive. I mentioned, you were just talking about positive parenting.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things I'm really going to unpack that in a lot of detail, but I wanted to add how important it is for parents. Let children overhear you talking about the positive things about them, because I hear in our support groups, tell us what we're right. We don't hear that very often. And a big, big emphasis is keeping transitions positive. When children are going back and forth between parents, uh, it's an emotional environment for them. And I've heard many children talk about their mixed feelings during transitions. They call it sometimes the dreaded switch day.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's very hard for children, particularly if parents aren't speaking to each other during transitions. And that icy silence can be very, very stressful for kids. I've heard young children say, well, I'm afraid if something bad happened to me or if I got lost, they wouldn't be able to help me or find me because they don't talk to each other. So, transition time ideally should be a time of focus on the child and in a positive way. At least, hopefully, parents can be greeting each other.
That's such a great point. It's very difficult, like you said, in those contentious times. And so many of the things that you've brought up are probably things that we don't even think about, as parents in the background that are running through our children's heads. So, like you said, opening up that time to speak with them and then also really just trying to focus on making that availability for them to see the positives and see that working together is such a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. And this is what I love about working with children because they often won't be able to say that directly to their parents, yet they have so much courage and can open up in the safety of a group with other children or in the safety of a therapeutic environment. So I want to emphasize some things about effective communication between co-parents and how important it is to approach child-related concerns with a problem-solving approach and avoiding blame. And if you are going to make say a complaint or a concern, to propose solutions and work toward compromise over time. And Heather, I'm so aware, I think we all are, of the power of our language and how important it is in communicating with a former partner to be able to say, our son, instead of, well, I'm going to make decisions about my son, referring to children as our children. That conveys that message of collaboration, that encourages cooperation. And then there's that golden rule of communication, how important it is to stay away from you never or you always, and instead to be able to communicate with those classic I messages. Being able to, instead of saying, you're not paying much attention to how my son's doing in school. Rather, I'm really concerned about our son's struggles with math. And being able to make a request. You're really good at math. It would be so helpful if you could spend some time with him on it when he's with you this week. Powerful difference that makes in communication. And having, again, expressing appreciation goes a long way toward building goodwill. We all know how important it is to keep written communication, text, and messages respectful. And I often say, limit it to just one topic at a time. I hear from so many parents who say, well, I didn't respond to her because there were 10 things and it was overwhelming, or I didn't respond to him because of that. And so helpful to read over those texts or emails and before sending, especially if it's an emotional issue. Wait till overnight and read it over again and keep those requests clear, brief, respectful, as again you would do in a successful business relationship. Again, following up those agreements in writing and sticking to those agreements is very helpful, and resources like Talking Parents is especially helpful in keeping communication clear and reducing conflict. And again, if things are unclear, how it's important to not assume the worst, as we
Positive
can.
intent.
You got it. How easy it is to slip away from that and assuming the negative. And important to, again, be able to say, I just want to check in to clarify. And I like to emphasize that co-parenting is a continuum. Co-parenting at one end of the spectrum, of course, means frequent communication. But if there's high conflict or if safety is an issue, certainly parallel parenting is a better alternative and reduces the likelihood of conflict. And it can go back and forth. Sometimes some parents find in the early stages of a separation that they need a little more distance and more parallel parenting, and then can communicate more frequently over time. But children can benefit from either approach as long as they're kept out of the middle of conflict. And there are handouts about this, I think, on your website that I've posted. And of course, we know how important it can be when disputes become really difficult to resolve, to consider the help of a neutral mediator or a mental health professional. And many parenting plans have that built into them. I'm in a lot of people's parenting plans for a safety net. And sometimes I never hear from them again. It's just helpful to build that in and know that it's there. I'm I think I want to emphasize how following these practices is a tall order. No such thing as perfect ways of communication, and progress isn't a straight line. We all zig and zag our way to that progress, and how important self care is, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I want to. I know you asked about quality parenting, so
Yes, jumped
let's.
ahead a little bit on that topic. So, yeah, just, getting into the quality parenting and how that helps children's resilience and healthy development, and then what positive parenting looks like, kind of to assist in that realm.
Yes, and again, one of my favorite topics because this is so important. There have been some longitudinal studies that show the power of positive parenting over time and what a difference it makes in children's long term adjustment into adulthood. I want to comment about, I'm using the word resilience a lot, and I want to be clear that children are not automatically resilient just because they're young. Sometimes we hear people say, oh, kids are resilient. Don't worry about it. Do whatever you feel like doing. Um, you know, Truthfully, resilience comes from it's building resilience is a combination of emotional skills that are taught and learned through the consistent practice of and support of responsive parents. It doesn't happen quickly, and the process happens over time. As you know, as a parent, as we all know as a parent, it's day by day, month by month, year by year. And some of those resilience skills include things like helping children learn to problem solve, not jumping in right away to solve a situation, but guiding and supporting them as they do, helping them handle big feelings. There are so many emotions that children are feeling as they go through family changes, and helping them be able to put that into words, which I'm going to talk about more and have some strategies for dealing with those, and helping them learn to ask for help when they need it, and developing patience and persistence and confidence to tolerate things when they don't work out. So those are a lot of those resilience skills that with practice, it's like a muscle that gets stronger over time. And so let me talk more about what that quality parenting looks like and how does it foster resilience. I define quality parenting as two pillars, right? Two pillars of effective parenting. One is warmth, nurturance, empathy, communication, connecting with children so that they know you are there for them with that unconditional love. But the second really important pillar, holding them up here, is creating structure, setting limits, healthy boundaries, setting limits on behaviors when they're unhealthy, unsafe, or inappropriate. And children need and want limits. It gives them a sense of security that parents will help them learn. And I think it's helpful to remember the word discipline comes from Latin for to teach, to lead. And that's part of what effective discipline, teaching, can really be a powerful path to the resilience. So I think one of the things that can happen, though, in the midst of fear, worry, stress, sometimes setting limits falls by the wayside. Sometimes parents feel guilty, understandably, because there's so much going on for their children emotionally that they let the behavior slide. We all understand, right? We understand how
Guilty.
that with us, right? No, absolutely. We're all human. And, we want our kids to be happy, and how easy it can be to just let it slide. And sometimes it's okay to let things slide. We want to pick and choose what we're setting the big limits on. But over time, both of those, love and limits, are so important for children's resilience. And a few things, just some basic things I want to mention is the power of play with children. We can get so busy, and we know for children, play is such an important bond. So steps that are packed into that quality parenting, finding time, making time, putting devices away. The number of times I hear children say they're always on their phones or their laptops. How important it is to be able to have that powerful, sometimes one-to-one time with each child. I consider one-to-one time in like Miracle Grow for relationships. And it's shown to contribute to stronger connection. So a focus on sharing experiences during these positive times with children. And I'm not talking about a trip to the mall or lavish gifts or trying to buy children's loyalty or affection. Children in our groups often talk about that. Don't give us everything just to get us to try and like you more than our other parent. They actually want to be able to have that time to connect. I think another part of responsive parenting and creating that stability is establishing new family fun time and traditions together. And maybe it's a weekly family game night, having outdoor activities, doing things together. I know parents have been very creative. One dad told me about how his kids look forward to Taco Tuesdays when they're with him, or a mom who said, "Well, it's my night, and we go to the Y, and we have a great time together." Children thrive on those kinds of routines, anchors them. Another thing that really helps build bonds of deeper connection is expressing appreciation to children and noticing their positive behaviors. And there's a wonderful concept in family therapy. It's about the ratio. If you're going to make one negative comment, hopefully you're also making 5 to 10 positive comments, and to the child, and hopefully to other important people in your life. So being able to notice when children are doing well, showing acts of kindness, catch them being good, and make sure to reinforce that. Uh, it's also so important to convey a message of hope and healing, and to acknowledge the tough times, and to listen and reassure. And, I can't emphasize enough how often we need to tune in to what's underneath children's behaviors. And sometimes they may have some misconceptions that it was, as I've heard many children say, "I think it was because of me that they fought." I could hear my name come up over and over again when they'd argue. Or as a young child said to me, "I know it was because of me because I wet the bed." And they argued over who was going to change the sheets. And then they got divorced. It's so hard for children to be able to say that to their parents. So if we can understand what I call childrenese, that a child and may even express it with a lot of anger, um, some they may say something like, I hate that woman that you're dating. I heard children in our group program talk about how they didn't like their parents' new partners. And I have 4 bonus children myself, so I was really curious about what that was about. And I said, how is it that you all have these big feelings about your parents and their new partners? One very brave 10-year-old, kind of misty-eyed, said, well, I'm afraid he loves her more now than he loves me. He's so excited when he sees her. Or yeah, they said, my mom's always so happy when her boyfriend comes over. And I don't get to sit in the front or next to her or him on the couch anymore. It's what I've come to call a fear of replacement when children talk with those very strong feelings about a parent's new partner. What they're fearing is that they're going to lose their special place in a parent's heart. And so when we can listen in those ways, I see. You don't like her so much. You probably have some reasons for that. And even if a child can't put it into words, I think it's so helpful if when parents can reassure their children, no one will ever take your special place in my heart. Love isn't like that. It's not like a piece of pie that there's less. There's only one you, and no one ever takes your place. That can be very, very comforting for children. So I think what we're talking about here are all the very strong emotions that children have that they can't always put into words. So much they feel, but seldom say. So how important it is to develop an emotional vocabulary for them. And there's being able to put feelings into words. There's some great neuroscience research that shows when we can put our strong emotions into words, labeling it, it shows a calming response in our brain. Being able to say, yeah, I really am sad, or I am really worried. And it changes the activity in the brain from the amygdala, which can really keep so much anxiety going. And it has a braking response, a calming response. And it really helps children develop their own neural pathways for managing strong feelings and being able to think about problem solving and ways to feel better. My book has a lot of in depth examples about how to talk, how to listen so kids will talk and open up and share their deepest feelings. But we always need to listen actively first and then join with the child to problem solve. Because Heather, we're all hardwired for connection, and we all have a strong need to be heard. As the poet Maya Angelou once said, we won't remember what people said, maybe, or what they did, but we'll remember how they made us feel.
It's one of my favorite quotes. I love that you brought that in. It's perfect for exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Carroll, in your book that you mentioned, Putting Children First, you emphasize that parents have a powerful influence over how their children adjust over time. And what if one parent is taking the high road, doing what they can for the child and putting them first, but then maybe the other parent isn't necessarily on the same page?
That's a great, great, great question because it happens often, and you can be doing your very best and how frustrating it can be, you know. And yet we know when we're working hard and we see someone else maybe isn't taking the high road, it's so important to remember we can't control other people, right? In fact, if we try to do that, it can be a recipe for our own depression and frustration and anxiety. But what we do know is how powerful it is when just one person, when one parent is taking the high road. And you know, Heather, there's some really compelling research done at Arizona State University that shows the difference uh, of when one person is doing everything they can to contain conflict, healthy boundaries, quality parenting. It has a com, they can compensate for the other parent over time. And these same researchers have shown that that one parent really engaging in those high quality um, practices that we know promote resilience, multiple benefits for children. I also want to mention those same researchers at Arizona State have an online parenting program called New Beginnings that teaches those skills for managing conflict and quality parenting. But it's a powerful message to parents that what you do matters, and I think that's very empowering. The other thing I want to mention about how hard this all is how important it is. These are tall orders for parents, and how important it is for self-care, another factor that contributes to both resilience for children and parents. And we hear often when we're traveling on a flight, and the flight attendant says, if you encounter turbulence and you're traveling with a young child, take the oxygen mask for yourself first. It's a great analogy that applies to life and parenting for sure. So I want to really encourage everyone to remember how important it is for self care, because we're better parents, right? When we refill, when we restore, and we have more to give. So things like basic things, regular exercise, getting out in nature, healthy diet, enough sleep. Sleep is so important for healthy brain development and everything that's positive. If you have a spiritual practice or yoga, meditation, all of this contributes to resilience over time. Connection with friends, staying connected with supportive people in your life. And I like to emphasize to parents, asking and seeking help when we need it is a sign of strength, not weakness. And seeing setbacks as temporary. Heather, a lot of great research about depression that shows when we see hard times in life, it's the three P's, as permanent, pervasive, and personal. In other words, thinking, oh, this is always going to be this way. It's about me, and it's never going to change. Those are things that can really contribute to depression and anxiety. The opposite is self compassion, knowing, yeah, this is hard right now, but I've been through hard times before. And adopting a gratitude practice can make a big difference. And considering forgiveness, both of oneself and maybe others down the road.
Those are all really great points. I love how you've put that into perspective, especially with the airplane analogy of having to take care of yourself, because if you're not the best self that you can be, you're not going to bring that into your parenting, especially when you're dealing with a high conflict situation or just being a single parent and learning how to kind of change the lifestyle and everything that you've had, and then being able to then emotionally support your child and be there for your child as well on top of that.
Exactly. Those are enormous challenges. And I have so much respect for parents who get up every day, even if yesterday didn't go well, and say, I'm doing it again. Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, if it comes from a place of love and, building that relationship with the child and figuring out the best way to move forward, that's kind of all the motivation that you need there.
That's right. And and hope, realistic hope for the future. I think of hope as the travel virtue that gets us through the tough times and the dark days and helps us see the light on the other side. And there's plenty of research that shows having that hopeful attitude for children, too, is a big predictor of resilience. I know we have time for one last question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you have been an advisor on Sesame Street, on their Resilience Project, and consulted on a variety of movies for families. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these other resources and then how resources like these can be helpful for parents and maybe how they can incorporate them where they live and figure out a way to work that in when they're dealing with these certain issues with their children?
Yeah, yeah. Heather, I love finding ways for parents and kids to connect in enjoyable, fun, safe ways. Because sometimes, if you say to your child, well, let's talk about this, doesn't always go so well. But when you can engage around, maybe reading a story and talking about it interactively, I like to encourage use of maybe videos, safe, non threatening ways to talk about sensitive issues. I worked with Sesame Street on their resilience project, and that link is on your site. There's a lot of great information there, not just for young children, but for parents to communicate with older youngsters too. And a lot of information about the anxieties that fears the children sometimes have, misconceptions, how parents can use those online resources interactively, and how effective that is to be able to engage in those fun ways. The other really delightful resource that's out there for older children to watch with parents is an animated movie I consulted on called Spellbound, which is now on Netflix. And it's a story of a 15-year-old Princess Elian, who discovers that her kingdom has this spell that's been cast, and her parents have turned into monsters voiced by Nicole Kidman and Javier Bardem. And Princess Elian takes on the daunting task of trying to solve her parents' problems and save the kingdom. We can probably figure out how that's going to go, right? But it's a very powerful story of love and forgiveness and learning that there's not just one kind of happily ever after for families. There are lots of different forms of happily ever after. And the other thing about this movie is it's filled with those valuable lessons, but it's also funny, entertaining. Music by Alan Menken, who did Little Mermaid music, so you'll get some earworms in there. But the important thing is, I'm hearing from parents literally so often, even in different countries, who say, wow, watching this movie with my kids opened up conversation about sensitive topics and a lot of big feelings that we hadn't really been able to talk about before. But there's something so powerful about seeing it in a safe way with animated characters and where there's, humor and fun. And it really is a tool for strengthening bonds and deeper communication with children. So I suggest to parents snuggle up on the couch with your kids and enjoy these opportunities to really connect, maybe in a deeper way.
Yeah, and that kind of brings through a lot of the things that you've talked about throughout today's presentation. You know, children feel a little bit more empowered when they hear from others and their peers that maybe they're going through the same situations. So being able to watch those movies or those TV shows and they see other children or other teens like themselves going through similar situations really helps them identify and go, wow, I'm not the only one. So it gives them that courage, as you spoke to earlier, to kind of come back and have that conversation, and then creating that one-on-one bonding time in that safe space, that nurturing, that empathy, and then that compassion that you have while you're watching a movie with your child. So you're kind of getting the 2-in-1 opportunity there to connect with them, but then also set that stage and open up a safe space for them to have those conversations. And maybe it's not I am feeling this way, but they can kind of have the conversation by talking about somebody else's issues or things that they're going through as part of the movie. And that way it doesn't seem so much like like you said, let's have a talk, type of thing. So I love that.
Exactly, Heather. You summarized it so well. And when kids can feel like they're not the only one, they're not alone with those feelings. And it creates this non threatening, safe space to say, yeah, she was really mad. Yeah. And to be able to talk about it. Yes. And
Absolutely. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
now I'm very aware that people may have some questions. So I'm going to stop. I could talk about
Absolutely.
these things for a long time, but I want to be mindful of time.
Sure. Yes, we do have some time for questions. Dr. Carroll, thank you so much for all of the incredible information. I know I've learned a lot today that I can take home and incorporate with my children and our co parenting situation as well. So thank you so much. But like you said, yes, we do have quite a few questions from our audience. So let me pull those up here. All right. Question number 1. Any specific recommendations for a situation where the parents split when the child was very young, so essentially has no memory of the family ever being together?
Yes, I'm curious about whether both parents are actively in the child's life. And if so, so many of these same ideas apply. And it's true that if a child doesn't have any memory of their ever being together, one of the things that can be so helpful is for the child to know, and hopefully this is true, you came from love. I often hear children worry, that if they're hearing so much negatives about a parent's relationship, that they may begin to feel that they were somehow defective and not lovable enough. Uh, if a child has no memory of when parents were together, they can still very much benefit from all that we've been talking about today about communication, both parents being hopefully on the same page with those ideas about positive parenting. Hopefully, both parents are contributing to the child's healthy development. And in many ways, it can be a positive. The child benefits from knowing, okay, they separated a long time ago, but they're still both very much caring about me and loving me and there for me.
Absolutely. That's such a great point. Any advice, maybe if when the split happened, the child was very young and maybe one of the parents is not involved?
Right. And, so often children process that reality at different stages in their life. And as they grow, they may have more questions, particularly as children get older. Well, why isn't he or she in my life? And that's a very sensitive issue, and one that can really needs to be handled with care. because I think one of the most important messages to that child is, you know, a child might feel like I wasn't lovable enough, and how important it is to be able to emphasize, and without knowing any of the circumstances, of course. You know, I know it can be something you wonder about, but one of the things I want to tell you is it wasn't because of you, that's for sure. In fact, sometimes adults have difficulties or problems of their own that make it hard for them to stay connected with their kids. But it sure is not because there was anything about you, and I would even go into saying, because you're an awesome kid.
Sure, I
And you're
love that. Keeping it
lovable.
very kind of simple to the point, and but then that reiteration of it's not the child's fault. I'm here for you now. You are so lovable, and keeping that there. I love that. Very nice. So one other question: how do I respond to my kids who constantly hear their dad lying about and bad mouthing me? I want them to know that those things are harmful and untrue, but don't know how to defend myself without basically calling their dad a liar.
Oh, that's a tough situation. Yeah, very hard. And I think one of the things that can be helpful in that situation is to be able to turn to the child and say, that must be hard for you to hear those things. Yeah, I imagine you have all kinds of feelings when you hear that stuff, huh? Yeah. And you know what? I'm sorry that you're hearing those negative things, because I think it must be pretty hard for you. And one of the things I think that can open up is communication between that parent and the child. If you have questions, I am happy to share with you, and in age appropriate ways, hopefully, anything that you might be wondering about. But I can also understand that it must be confusing for you to hear those things and to wonder what's true, what's not. And I can share with you my perspective, but I also really want to make sure that you're not feeling overwhelmed and upset by hearing all these things. So
Very good
focus
point.
on the child and what they're going through. And if the child has questions, being able to answer it in, again, reasonably age appropriate ways.
Excellent. So, not necessarily addressing the conflict that's going on between the parents there, but like you said, going back through making sure that the child is comfortable and that you can help them feel supported, and then open up that line of communication so that if they do have questions or if they are confused by one parent saying this, the other saying this, you're doing it that way. So, that's a great point, to really kind of deflect and get away from the conflict between the parents and then make it about that relationship between you and your child.
Right. And also telling the child, you know what? It's not your job to figure this out. I don't ever want you to get caught or feel caught in the middle between, you know, between the two of us. In fact, your job is to be, maybe the child's 10, to be the terrific 10-year-old that you are, and not try and figure out these complicated adult issues. But I'm
Great
happy to
point.
answer questions.
Yes. Let's see. We've got another one here. How do you make the most for your kids when there was physical, emotional, and psychological abuse in the relationship and it was the cause of the separation?
Well, first of all, my compassion to this writer that they went through that kind of abuse. And also, I respect his or her courage in getting out of the relationship. And again, this is where I think having healthy boundaries, having distance from an abusive former partner is so important. Safety is number one. And I hope this person, is this a male or a female? Do we know?
Um, I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll say I hope she is patting herself on the back for the courage that she has in getting out of an abusive relationship, and goodness knows all the challenges that go along with that. I hope she's focused on, when I talked before about how one parent taking the high road with quality parenting can make a powerful difference. So hopefully there's minimal or hardly any contact with a abusive former partner. But I hope this parent is really focused on feeling empowered and having a lot of self-compassion, that she's really done the right thing in getting out of an abusive relationship. And again, remembering the message of how one parent really being available for their child in those positive ways can really make a big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a tough situation. I think goes back to really focusing on that self-care, that recovery, and then building that relationship with the child post the separation, and making them feel as supportive and comfortable as possible.
And safe. And
Very.
safe. And also, she's setting an example for her children of, you know, here's, never allow anyone to treat you with abuse. And I'm here to keep you safe and keep you protected, and we're going to be okay. That message of hope and healing. I wish her all the
Absolutely.
best.
Looks like we've got time for a few more here. Any tips on collaboration and communication when the marriage broke down due to our inability to team up and work as partners? It's historically been difficult.
Yeah. Yes. Well, isn't that so true that when there are already challenges in communication in a marriage, not being on the same page, not working as a team, and then you add that to the challenges of separating, and then how do you do that? Well, I go back to that concept of the business like relationship, thinking about your co parenting relationship as that important focus on the business of raising healthy children. So being able to communicate about the important issues, and knowing that you may not always reach agreement. And there's interesting research from marriage therapy that shows 69% of couples in marriages never really resolve their differences, but instead, have empathy and try and understand the other person's point of view and kind of agree to disagree. And it's true in co-parenting as well, that you won't always see eye to eye on things. But on the big, important matters, hopefully you can reach compromise. And if you're using those tools for effective communication, making a request about things, offering solutions, I think that business-like model of what we would do in a work relationship can go a long way in a situation where you're not often on the same page.
Kind of helps cut that emotion out. That way you can focus on the core issues and like you've resonated through the entire time we've been speaking today, really staying solutions focused and child focused as well. So I agree. The business relationship just makes so much sense, especially in
Yeah,
those contentious situations.
yeah. And sometimes it's very helpful to be able to brainstorm solutions to situations that come up and to say in communication, what are your thoughts? What do you suggest? And maybe it's a compromise point. You know, each neither parent gets all of what they want, but the solution ends up being a reasonably good one for the children.
Excellent point. Let's see. Dr. JoAnne Pedro-Carroll, do you have any suggestions for any resources for teenagers on the spectrum for navigating a divorce through the various steps?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And, I always encourage use of resources, and it can be helpful to engage the support of a qualified mental health professional. And, Psychology Today has a great um, list of resources where you can tune into even seeing a video of each person who's in your area that maybe is especially helpful with adolescents or adolescents on the spectrum. Getting help, again, I can't emphasize enough, is such a sign of strength when we need it. Um, I think I'm a big believer in the power of support groups for children and youth. Knowing you're not alone, knowing you're not the only one dealing with all these feelings. So I would check in with your local mental health association. Sometimes schools offer these groups. Um, Maybe getting referrals from your child's pediatrician. There are a lot of resources out there. And um, again, even watching a movie like Spellbound together can open up communication because, the main character in there is a 15-year-old, and she's going through a lot of intense emotions, and that can be used as a talking point and a teaching tool. But definitely reaching out for support. It's hard in life to go it alone during our tough times. And there's great research about longevity and health. The 75-year-old Harvard study that shows what predicts happiness, health, and longevity. It's connection, social connection. The more we can connect with supportive people in our lives, we don't have to go it alone. So I hope this parent um, can reach out and find the supports available for her and her adolescent, or him. I can't tell the gender.
Let's see. Do you have any advice for teaching resilience to my adoptive daughters while not alienating their biological mother? Their biological mom has access, but tends to be mentally abusive.
Hmm. Oh, yes. Yeah. Great question. Again, this comes down to each person in a child's life can make a positive difference. And, we did some research at our university a few years ago and asked the question of what were the factors that children who'd been through some pretty tough times, what helped them with more resilience. And one of them was the consistent presence of a positive caregiver in that child's life. So this person can have a very powerful impact, um, whether or not their biological parent is on board with the same practices. My book has lots of information, chapters on parenting for resilience that has tools, activities, things. And I think uh, the presence, when a child knows that there's this one person they can go to talk about anything they want to talk about, they can express all their feelings. I mean, she doesn't have to say anything about their biological parent other than, yeah, so she has some challenges of her own. But maybe you can think about this for yourself. Help them develop their own strong sense of confidence within themselves, help them learn those skills for managing their own strong emotions, help them be able to think of a variety of solutions when they're faced with a problem. Can be a simple problem like, you forgot to bring your lunch money for school. How do you want to handle that? Being able to be there for them in ways that they know they're not alone can make a powerful difference.
Excellent. Well, I think we have time for, let's say, one or two more questions. So I've got a couple more for you before we wrap it up today. This one, in a high conflict co parenting relationship, what are strategies to implement to successfully shift from a winning the argument mindset to a parallel parenting dynamic?
Oh, yes. Boy, nobody wins when you try to win the argument, right? Absolutely. Um, and again, parallel parenting is a better option because it means less because there's less contact, there's less opportunity for conflict.
Mhm.
And again, there's a handout in on your resource page, tips for successful parallel parenting. I think there are 12 of them on there. I can mention a few of them, but one is in communication, to keep it respectful, keep it clear, and keep it pretty simple, one topic at a time. And if you can begin to introduce language, I mentioned the language of referring to children as our children, being able to be courteous and respectful in communication, um, starting a communication with hi and the person's name, ending it with I appreciate your consideration of this. If you could get back to me by the end of the week, I'd really appreciate it. Sometimes just changing up the language can make a difference. And again, managing your own strong emotions and being able to help yourself disengage from the triggers, because there are probably a lot of things getting stirred up: old pain, old hurt, betrayal. These are hard emotions to manage. So making sure that communication is, again, businesslike, respectful, and keeping it child focused. I can't emphasize enough, and maybe that parent wants to try the technique of, when that former partner is calling, having her children or child's picture pop up on the phone. Really helps with calming the nervous system. But trying to win arguments, in my view, is not going to be helpful or effective for anybody. In fact, that's where kids get caught in the middle. But looking for points of compromise, looking for points of overlap, being able to say, sometimes being able to say, I know that deep down inside, we both want what's best for our children.
Absolutely. Very well said. And let's see, we'll have one more question before we wrap up with any final remarks for this morning's co parenting and coffee. Any advice on raising resilient children through a long distance relationship with a toxic co parent?
Mm. A lot of challenges packed into that question, right? Um, First of all, the long distance relationship makes me wonder how often the children will see that other parent. Um, and when I hear the word toxic, I think there's probably a lot packed into that. Maybe there are mental health issues. Maybe there's a long-standing history of pretty intense conflict. And again, this is the key, is for children to be protected from that conflict, kept out of the middle. And it's a little tricky for me to know, are children getting on a plane to go see that parent? Is the parent coming into town? It comes back to how helpful it is to keep communication with children open, to be able to say, to have their voices heard, first of all, about their feelings about, how often, what are those visits like with the other parent. And this is where it can be very helpful to have the guidance of a qualified mental health professional. Because again, in my experience, there's so much that children feel but seldom say, because they don't want to make waves, they don't want to stress a parent. And sometimes they fear that if they say how they really feel, they could lose a parent's love and connection. And the benefit of having a neutral, skilled professional to help guide some of those decisions can be so helpful for children. But to keep communication open between this parent and their children, so that they're not put in harm's way. I'm having all kinds of questions myself about what it might be like for them. Keeping their needs a top priority is really important, and have their
Absolutely.
voice heard.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry?
I have children's voices heard. I like to be able to think about it as, give children a voice about these things, understand what their feelings are. I mean, you don't want to put the burden on them of deciding a schedule, but you do want to know what their feelings are. So, and Heather, I like to think of all this effort that we put into resilience and help in children and helping them thrive. We're actually building healthy parents for future generations. Today's children are tomorrow's parents, right? So the more we can build in connection, um, communication, love, we're building a better future for our
So very
world.
well put. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and just people in general, right? That's such a great point. So, Dr. Carroll, before we wrap up today, thank you again so much for all your time and all of this great information. I know our audience has really enjoyed it, just given the volume of questions that we've had come through today. Do you have any final words or statements or affirmations that you would like to give the audience today and kind of send them off into the day, hopefully with some positive mindsets?
Oh, absolutely. And this is hard stuff, right? I don't ever want to minimize how challenging it is to show up for children, especially when you're dealing with a lot of emotion and a lot of challenging changes in life. And I think it's so important to do what I call install the good. think about, notice during the day. This comes from neuropsychologist Rick Hansen, who wrote a book on resilience. Notice the positive things of the day. Take it in so that when you are getting ready to end your day, to go to sleep at night, think in a lot of detail about maybe it was your child who just came in and spontaneously gave you a hug and said, I love you. Notice how it felt. How'd you feel in your body? Notice the calmness that came over you. Have gratitude and really focus on maybe what went well that day so that you're giving yourself the grace and the self compassion to know you're doing your best. It's no such thing as perfect, but the more that you can be caring for yourself, knowing that you're caring for your children too. So, my very best wishes to all of you as parents. It's the most important job we have, right? And in many ways,
Absolutely.
most challenging. So,
Well, thank you again, Dr. Carroll. This has been wonderful. Again, so much great information, great knowledge for everyone to take away. And again, thank you to everybody that has joined us today for our co parenting and coffee. And we look forward to having you guys back again very soon on our next topic coming up in just a few months.
thank you, Heather. It's been my pleasure.